The auctioneer's gavel came down like a judge sentencing the land to whatever fool would take it. $1, he said, and the word hung in the air of the county courthouse steps like smoke that couldn't decide whether to rise or fall. Around me, men in boots and ball caps shuffled, cleared throats, studied their phones. Nobody wanted it. Nobody but me, apparently, because my hand went up before my brain could argue, and suddenly I owned 340 acres of Colorado scrubland that the bank had given up on like a dog too sick to feed. The paperwork smelled like old coffee and failure. 23 years old, I signed my name, Ethan Wade, in the same crooked slant my father had used before the cancer took him 6 months prior. The clerk, a woman with bifocals on a beaded chain, looked at me the way you'd look at someone walking into traffic on purpose. "You know there's no water rights," she said. "You know the house is condemned. You know there's liens from 3 different contractors and a tax bill that'll make you wish you'd bought a lottery ticket instead." "I know," I said, though I didn't. Not really. What I knew was this. My father had spent his last week alive talking about that ranch in a morphine haze, calling it the Bishop Place, saying his own father, my grandfather Daniel, had worked there in the early 80s before everything went wrong. He'd said the name like a prayer he'd forgotten the words to. He'd said, "If you ever get the chance," and then he'd drifted and never finished. So here I was, chance in hand, broke as a hymn, driving a Chevy that burned oil like incense toward a ranch I'd bought for the price of a gas station cappuccino. The road out of Crowley was the kind that makes you wonder if you missed a turn an hour ago. Fences sagged under the weight of tumbleweeds. Billboards for defunct motels tilted like headstones. The sky was huge and empty, the blue so deep it hurt to look at too long, and by the time I found the turnoff, marked only by a bleached cattle skull wired to a post, the sun had started its long slide toward the mountains. The gate was open. Had been for years, probably. The chain that once held it lay in the dirt like a snake that had given up on being dangerous. I drove through, tires crunching over gravel that sounded like old bones, and there it was, the Bishop Ranch, or what was left of it. The house squatted in the distance, roof caved in on the south side, porch rails hanging like broken fingers. Outbuildings dotted the property, grey and leaning, as if the wind had spent decades trying to push them over and hadn't quite managed. But it was the barn that stopped me. Massive red paint peeling in sheets, double doors chained shut with a padlock the size of my fist. Rust had claimed the hasp, but the lock itself looked newer, shinier, like someone had replaced it in the last decade, and then walked away. I killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was total. No birds, no insects, just wind moving through the gaps in the barn's siding, a low whistle that sounded almost like language, if you listened wrong. I got out, boots hitting dirt that puffed into dust, and stood there, trying to figure out what the hell I'd just done. My phone had no signal. The nearest neighbor, according to the county map, was 11 miles east. I had a duffel bag of clothes, a cooler with 3 days of food, and a toolbox my father had left me that contained more rust than function. The house was a lost cause. I could see that from here, but the barn had a presence. It sat in the landscape like a secret someone had tried to bury standing up. I walked toward it, and the wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and something else, something almost sweet, like hay that had fermented in the dark. The padlock had no key. Of course it didn't. I rattled the chain, tested the doors, found them solid despite their appearance. Whoever had locked this had meant it to stay locked. I walked the perimeter, looking for another way in, and found the small side door, wood swollen from decades of weather, frame warped. I put my shoulder into it. Once, twice. On the third shove it gave with a sound like a rib cracking, and I stumbled into the dark. The smell hit first. Dust, yes, and rot, but under that, something sharper. Oil, metal, the kind of smell you get in a workshop where things are made or unmade. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and swept it across the interior. The barn was enormous, stalls lined both sides, doors hanging open or missing entirely. The loft above groaned in the wind. Hay bales, ancient and compressed into something closer to stone, were stacked in one corner. Farm equipment, unidentifiable under tarps and cobwebs, hulked in the shadows. And in the center of it all, taking up a space that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, was a concrete slab, 6 feet by 6 feet, smooth, uncracked. In a barn where everything else had surrendered to time, this slab looked like it had been poured yesterday. I walked over, knelt, ran my hand across the surface. Cold. Unmarked except for a single detail in the corner. Initials carved shallow but clear. D.W. 1982, Daniel Wade. My grandfather. The same year my father said everything went wrong. I sat back on my heels, phone light shaking in my hand, and felt the weight of inheritance settle over me like a coat made of questions. Whatever my grandfather had done here, whatever he'd left, it was still waiting. The barn held its breath around me, and somewhere in the loft something shifted, a soft sound like a sigh or a warning. I was 23, broke, and owned a mystery I didn't know how to solve. But I'd come this far on $1 and a dead man's half-finished sentence. I wasn't leaving until I knew what the silence was hiding. I spent the first night in the Chevy with the doors locked and the windows cracked, listening to the barn settle and complain in the dark like an old man's joints. Sleep came in thin strips, torn apart every time the wind slammed something loose against the siding, or a coyote sent up a howl that made the distance feel smaller than it was. By the time dawn crept over the eastern plains, pale and reluctant, I'd made a decision. I was going to break open that slab. I drove into Crowley at first light, the truck's engine knocking in a rhythm that suggested I had maybe a month before it gave up entirely, and found a hardware store that looked like it had survived more out of spite than profit. The owner, a man named Carl with forearms like fence posts and a mustache that belonged in a 70s cop show, rang up my purchase without comment. Sledgehammer, pry bar, work gloves, a battery-powered drill with a concrete bit, and a case of water, because I'd learned that dehydration makes bad decisions feel reasonable. "You working the Bishop place," Carl said. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when a stranger buys a property at auction for pocket change. "Yeah," I said. "Heard about that," he said, scanning the sledgehammer. He paused, looked at me with the kind of directness that makes you check your shoes for dog shit. "Your granddad worked there back in the day, didn't he?" I nodded. Carl grunted, handed me the receipt. Bishop was a strange man. Paid well, but kept to himself. When he disappeared in '83, folks had theories, most of them ugly. Your granddad left town right after. Never came back. "Did they ever find Bishop?" I asked. Carl shook his head. "Nope. Ranch sat empty till the bank took it. Been through 4 owners since. None of them lasted more than a year." He looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't encouragement either. "Good luck, son," he said, and it sounded like a prayer at a funeral. Back at the ranch, I set up in the barn with the determination of someone who's already committed and can't afford to second guess. The concrete slab stared up at me, daring me to make the first move. I started at the edge, where the letters D.W. marked the corner, and swung the sledgehammer with everything I had. The impact rang through the barn, sent a shockwave up my arms, and left a mark about as deep as a fingernail scratch. I swung again, and again. By the time the sun was directly overhead, I'd managed to chip away a section the size of a dinner plate, and my hands were blistered despite the gloves. The concrete was reinforced. Whoever poured this didn't want it opened easily or ever. I switched to the drill, the bit screaming as it chewed into the slab, dust rising in a cloud that coated my throat and made me cough like a coal miner. Hours passed. The sun moved. My back started sending up complaints that turned into demands. But slowly, painfully, I made progress. By late afternoon, I drilled a perimeter of holes, and when I jammed the pry bar into the gap and leaned my full weight on it, something gave. A crack spider-webbed across the surface. I worked the bar deeper, muscles screaming, and with a sound like a bone breaking, a section of the slab lifted. Beneath it, darkness, and a smell that made me step back. Not rot, not death, but something chemical, preservative, like formaldehyde but sweeter, mixed with earth and rust. I grabbed my phone, shined the light into the gap, and saw it. A wooden crate, old military style, stenciled with faded letters I couldn't quite read. It sat in a cavity that had been dug below the barn floor, lined with plastic sheeting that had kept the moisture out. The crate itself looked intact, edges sealed with what might have been wax or tar. I pried away more concrete, widened the hole until I could reach down and get my hands on the crate. It was heavier than I expected, and when I hauled it up, grunting and swearing, and set it on the barn floor, I had to sit down for a minute just to catch my breath. The crate was about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, a foot deep. The lid was secured with a simple latch, no lock, but the seal around the edges had hardened into something that required the pry bar to crack. When it finally gave, the lid opened with a sound like a gasp, and I found myself staring at something I couldn't immediately process. Money, but not cash. Bonds. Dozens of them, stacked and wrapped in plastic, each one printed with ornate borders and the words United States Savings Bond. Below them, another layer. Gold coins, not loose but organized in tubes, each tube labeled in precise handwriting. Krugerrands, maple leafs, American eagles, dates ranging from the late 70s to early 80s. And beneath that, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather journal. I lifted it out with hands that had started to shake. The cover was embossed with initials, R.B. Robert Bishop, the man who'd owned this ranch, the man who'd disappeared. I opened the journal, and the first page was dated January 1982, written in a hand that was neat but hurried, like someone documenting evidence they knew might be needed later. "If you're reading this," it began, "then I either trusted you or I'm dead. Either way, you've found what I spent 5 years hiding. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" I sat in that barn as the light turned gold, and then amber, reading words that unraveled a story I didn't know I was part of. Bishop had been running a side operation, buying gold and bonds during the early 80s, when inflation was a beast and people with cash were looking for safety. He'd built a network of clients, farmers and ranchers who didn't trust banks, who wanted their wealth in something they could hold. My grandfather, Daniel, had been his partner. They'd done well. Too well, apparently, because by the end of 1982 someone had noticed. The journal mentioned names I didn't recognize, threats that had started as phone calls and escalated to late-night visits. Bishop had decided to hide everything, bury it literally until things cooled down. He'd written the date he planned to dig it up, April 1983. He never made it. And my grandfather, according to the final entry, had left town 3 days after Bishop vanished, taking nothing, saying nothing, disappearing into a life that would eventually produce my father and, years later, me. The last line of the journal was a question without an answer. Who do you trust when the treasure isn't yours to keep? I closed the journal and looked at the contents of the crate. Bonds that might be worth thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, depending on maturity. Gold that, even at a conservative estimate, could be worth $250,000 or more. Enough to change my life. Enough to pay off my father's medical debts. Enough to start over, or enough to bury me the same way it had buried Bishop. The barn creaked, settling into evening, and I realized I had no idea what to do next. Outside, the wind picked up, and in the distance, I heard the sound of an engine. Someone was coming. If you've made it this far, you're hooked on something deeper than gold. You're here for the mystery, the weight of buried choices, the question of what you'd do if inheritance came with a price tag made of secrets. If stories like this, ones that dig into dirt and consequence and the ghosts we inherit, keep you up at night in the best way, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and tell me in the comments, if you found a fortune your family buried, would you keep it, report it, or run? I want to know what you'd choose, because the next part of this story depends on understanding what people do when the right answer isn't clear. Now, back to the engine in the distance, and the choice I didn't have time to make. The vehicle that pulled up wasn't a cop, which was either good news or worse news depending on what came next. It was a Ford pickup, newer than mine by about 2 decades, midnight blue with a toolbox in the bed, and a bumper sticker that read, "I support wildlife, I hunt mountain lions." The driver killed the engine and sat there for a moment, assessing the situation the way you do when you're deciding if you're about to make a mistake. Then the door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was maybe 40, 45, with dark hair pulled back in a braid, jeans that had seen actual work, and a canvas jacket with the name Morrison Surveying stitched on the breast. Her face had the kind of weathering that comes from years in the sun, lines around the eyes that suggested she smiled more than she frowned, but she wasn't smiling now. She looked at me, then at the barn, then back at me. "You, Ethan Wade," she called across the distance. Her voice carried authority without aggression. "Yeah," I said, stepping out of the barn and hoping I didn't look as guilty as I felt. Crate full of treasure behind me, no clear plan, just adrenaline and the beginnings of a headache that suggested I'd forgotten to drink water for 6 hours. "I'm Grace Morrison," she said, walking closer but stopping a respectful distance away. "I surveyed this property back in '97 when the bank first took it. Been watching the auction listings. Saw your name on the transfer." She paused, hands in her pockets. "Your grandfather was Daniel Wade." I nodded. She studied me a moment longer, then sighed like someone who'd been carrying a question for decades and finally had someone to ask. "You find anything weird yet?" she said. The question hung between us, and I had about 3 seconds to decide how much truth to give a stranger. The smart move was to lie, play dumb, say I'd just been cleaning up, but something in her face stopped me. She didn't look like she was fishing. She looked like she already knew the answer and was just waiting to see if I'd be honest. "I found a crate," I said slowly, "under the barn floor. Bonds, gold, and a journal that says my grandfather was involved in something that got a man disappeared." Grace nodded like I'd just confirmed the weather forecast. "Robert Bishop," she said. "I figured that's what was under there." She walked past me toward the barn, not asking permission, and I followed because what else was I going to do? She stopped at the entrance, looked at the broken concrete, the crate sitting on the floor, and let out a low whistle. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said quietly. "My father knew him, worked with him on a few jobs before Bishop hired him full-time. When Bishop vanished, the rumors got ugly fast. Some said he skipped town with client money. Others said he got killed by someone he cheated, but my father always said Daniel Wade wouldn't have run unless he had a damn good reason." She turned to look at me. "You planning to keep this?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "The journal makes it sound like this was client money, not Bishop's. If that's true, then it's not mine to keep, but the clients are probably dead or gone, and I've got debts that could drown me." Grace leaned against the doorframe, considering. "Here's what I know," she said. "In '82, '83, there was a man named Vincent Cross operating out of Denver. He was a loan shark, but the kind with a lawyer and a nice suit. He'd moved into rural areas, lending money at rates that made the banks look charitable. Word was, Bishop had taken money from Cross to finance his gold operation, then couldn't pay back when Cross wanted out. Cross didn't file papers, he filed threats." She let that sit for a moment. "My father said Daniel left because Cross's people came looking, asking questions with tire irons. Bishop disappeared first. Daniel disappeared second. Nobody ever proved anything. But Cross died in '91, and his operation fell apart. So whoever Bishop owed, they're likely gone, which means legally this is probably yours. But morally," she shrugged, "that's the harder math." We stood there in the fading light, the barn around us like a cathedral built for secrets, and I felt the weight of choice pressing down like a hand on the back of my neck. I could liquidate everything, pay my debts, start fresh. Or I could do what my grandfather apparently hadn't been able to do, finish what Bishop started. The journal mentioned clients, I said, names, addresses. If they're still alive, or if their families are, maybe this belongs to them. Grace raised an eyebrow. You're 23, broke, and sitting on a fortune, and you're thinking about giving it back. You're either noble or stupid. Maybe both, I said. She laughed, the sound surprising and warm in the cold air. All right, she said. If you're serious, I know someone who might be able to help. Lawyer in Pueblo, handles estate stuff, old claims, not cheap but fair. And if you decide to go that route, you're going to need documentation, provenance, the whole 9 yards. Otherwise, the state will seize it, tie it up in court for a decade, and you'll see nothing. She pulled a business card from her pocket, handed it over. Her information was printed neatly, but on the back, she'd written a name in pen. Marcus Delgado, attorney at law. Call him, she said. Tell him I sent you. And Ethan, she added, her voice dropping serious. Be careful who else you tell about this. Small towns have long memories and short ethics when money's involved. People will crawl out of the woodwork, claiming they're owed. Some of them will be lying, some of them won't be. Either way, it's going to get complicated. She walked back to her truck, paused before getting in. One more thing, she said. My father told me once that Daniel Wade was the kind of man who did the right thing, even when it cost him everything. I don't know if that's true, but if you're anything like him, you're going to make the hard choice. Just make sure it's the one you can live with. She drove off, leaving me alone with the crate and the weight of a legacy I hadn't asked for. I spent that night in the barn, sleeping bag laid out next to the crate, sledgehammer within arm's reach in case someone less friendly than Grace decided to visit. I didn't sleep much. Instead, I read through Bishop's journal cover to cover, taking notes, cross-referencing names. There were 17 clients listed. Addresses scattered across Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska. Some had made deposits as small as $5,000. Others had gone all in, $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 converted to gold and bonds. Bishop had been meticulous, every transaction dated, signed, witnessed. He'd built a system that should have been bulletproof, but systems only work when everyone plays by the rules, and Vincent Cross clearly hadn't. By dawn, I'd made a list. 11 clients were marked deceased in Bishop's notes, dates of death recorded in the margins. That left 6 possibles, 6 families who might still be out there, wondering what happened to the money they'd entrusted to a man who vanished. 6 reasons to do the hard thing. I packed the journal and a sample bond into my backpack, resealed the crate, and covered the hole with a tarp, weighed down with cinder blocks. Then I drove into Crowley, found a payphone outside a gas station because my cell still had no signal, and called Marcus Delgado. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice rough like he'd been awake for 30 hours, or asleep for 3. This is Delgado. Grace Morrison sent me, I said. I found something that needs a lawyer who knows how to handle ghosts. There was a pause, then a low chuckle. Son, he said, I charge $200 an hour. And ghost cases take longer than you'd think. You sure you want to open this? No, I said, but I'm going to anyway. All right, he said, get to my office by noon. Bring everything you've got. And Ethan, he added, if what you found is what I think it is, you just became the most interesting problem in 3 counties. Congratulations, you're going to hate it. Marcus Delgado's office was above a barbershop in Pueblo, accessed by a narrow staircase that smelled like aftershave and old carpet. The door at the top had his name stenciled in gold leaf that was flaking at the edges, and when I knocked, a voice told me to come in like it was issuing a challenge. The office was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who charged $200 an hour but didn't waste money on appearances. Shelves crammed with law books, a desk buried under file folders, a coffee maker that looked like it had survived a war, and a window with a view of the street below where people moved through their lives, unaware that upstairs someone was about to complicate mine further. Delgado himself was in his 60s, Latino, with silver hair combed back and reading glasses perched on a nose that had been broken at least once. He wore a button-down shirt, with the sleeves rolled up and a bolo tie that featured a turquoise stone, the size of a shooter marble. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. Sit. Talk. I sat, pulled the journal from my backpack, and slid it across. He opened it, scanned the first few pages, and his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, he muttered. Robert Bishop. I haven't heard that name in 30 years. He read further, flipping pages with a care that suggested he understood he was holding evidence, not just paper. You said you found bonds and gold. How much are we talking about? I told him. He whistled low. And you want to find the original clients or their heirs? That's right. Why? The question wasn't accusatory. It was genuine curiosity, the kind a doctor might use when asking why you'd choose surgery over painkillers. Because if I don't, I said slowly, then I'm just a thief with a good excuse. My grandfather ran. Maybe he had to, but I'm not him. I can finish what he started. Delgado leaned back in his chair, laced his fingers behind his head, and studied me with the intensity of someone calculating odds. Noble, he said finally. Stupid, but noble. Here's what you need to know. Estate law in Colorado is complicated. Unclaimed property, especially money hidden for 4 decades, technically reverts to the state after a dormancy period. However, if we can prove these bonds and gold were held in trust, informally, with intent to return, then we might have a case for directing them to rightful heirs. Might being the operative word. We'll need documentation, witnesses, if any are still alive, and a judge who's willing to entertain the idea that your grandfather and Bishop weren't criminals, just desperate. He leaned forward. It's going to take time, months, maybe a year, and it's going to cost you. I can pay, I said. I've got a little saved. He shook his head. Not money. Time. Energy. Scrutiny. The moment we file, this becomes public record. People will come out of the woodwork, some with legitimate claims, others with stories they've tailored to fit. You'll be questioned, investigated, possibly accused of everything from grave robbing to fraud. And at the end of it, if we win, you'll have given away a fortune to strangers. You comfortable with that? I thought about my father's last days, the medical bills I was still paying in installments, the Chevy that was one breakdown away from becoming a lawn ornament. I thought about the barn and the concrete slab and the journal that had waited 40 years for someone to care enough to read it. Yeah, I said. I'm comfortable. All right then, Delgado said, closing the journal. Let's get to work. The process started with the bonds. Delgado had a contact at the Treasury Department, a woman named Hilton who specialized in tracking old savings bonds and determining their current value. I mailed her photocopies, kept the originals locked in a safe deposit box at the Crowley Bank, the only institution I semi-trusted. Hilton called back 3 days later with numbers that made my hands shake. The bonds, which had a face value of roughly $300,000 in the 80s, had matured and accrued interest over 4 decades. They were now worth just over $900,000. The gold was harder to assess without selling, but based on weight and market value, Delgado estimated another $400,000. Total, $1.3 million. Enough to change lives, enough to ruin them if handled wrong. While we waited for legal channels to grind forward, I started tracking down the clients. The first name on the list was Arthur Brennan, listed as deceased in 1989. His address led me to a small house in Lamar, where a woman in her 70s answered the door with suspicion carved into every line of her face. I'm looking for information about Arthur Brennan, I said. I'm handling an estate matter. She squinted. I'm his daughter, Linda. What kind of estate? The kind that involves money your father invested in 1982. Her expression shifted from suspicion to something sharper. Anger, maybe, or old grief surfacing. My father gave $20,000 to a man named Bishop, she said. Never saw a dime back. Bishop disappeared and we lost everything. Had to sell the farm, move into town. So if you're here to tell me there's money, you're 40 years too late to matter. I understand, I said carefully. But if there's a legal process to return what was owed, would you want to pursue it? She stared at me for a long moment, then stepped aside. You better come in, she said. We're going to need coffee for this. Over the next 3 weeks, I found 5 of the 6 remaining clients, or their families. Each conversation was a variation on the same theme. Initial disbelief, followed by anger at how long it had taken, followed by cautious, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something good could come from all that loss. The 6th client, a man named Eugene Hastings, had moved to Arizona in the 90s and left no forwarding address. Delgado hired a private investigator who tracked him to a retirement community in Tucson. Still alive at 91, still bitter about the $25,000 he'd lost. When I called him, he laughed, a laugh that sounded like gravel in a blender. "You telling me Bishop's gold finally surfaced," he said. "Son, I stopped believing in fairness around the time Nixon resigned. But if you're serious, send me the paperwork. I've got nothing but time and a need to win one before I check out." Delgado filed the petition in late September. The hearing was set for November. In the meantime, word spread. The Pueblo chieftain ran a story. Local man seeks to return hidden fortune to Depression-era investors. It was mostly accurate, though they got the era wrong and made me sound more heroic than I felt. The article brought attention I didn't want. 3 people called claiming to be related to clients who weren't on Bishop's list. A man showed up at the ranch, insisting his uncle had given Bishop $50,000 and demanding a cut. I referred him to Delgado. He never called back. And then there was the visit from a man who introduced himself as Vincent Cross Jr. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a black Lexus that looked out of place on the dirt road, like a tuxedo at a rodeo. He was in his 50s, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He knocked on the barn door where I was working, sorting through old equipment to sell for scrap, and when I opened it, he smiled. The smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ethan Wade," he said, extending a hand I didn't take. "I'm Vincent Cross. I believe you have something that belonged to my father. Your father's dead," I said. He nodded, unbothered. "He is. But debts don't die. My father lent Robert Bishop $150,000 in 1982. Bishop defaulted. I have documentation, which means legally I have a claim to whatever you found." I stared at him, and something cold settled in my chest. "Your father was a loan shark." "That's an unkind word," Cross said, still smiling. "He was a businessman, and businesses collect. Now we can do this the easy way, where you and I come to an arrangement, or we can do it in court, where I have very expensive lawyers, and you have Marcus Delgado." He said Delgado's name like it was a joke. "I'll see you in court," I said, and closed the door in his face. Through the gap, I heard him laugh. "See you soon, Ethan," he called. "And for what it's worth, your grandfather made the smart choice." He ran. "You should too." The hearing took place in a courtroom that smelled like furniture polish and the accumulated anxiety of 1,000 prior disputes. Judge Catherine Morales presided, a woman in her late 50s with gray hair cut short and a reputation for suffering neither fools nor lengthy arguments. Delgado sat to my left, a stack of files in front of him organized with the precision of a man who'd done this enough times to know that details win cases. To my right sat the families, 6 people representing the clients Bishop had promised to protect. Linda Brennan, Arthur's daughter, wore a dress she'd probably bought for the occasion. Eugene Hastings had flown in from Tucson, his walker parked beside the bench. Across the aisle sat Vincent Cross Jr. with 2 attorneys in suits that cost more than my truck. They exuded the kind of calm that comes from knowing the system bends toward money. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Morales looked over her reading glasses at the assembled parties, then at the case file in front of her. "This is unusual," she said, her voice carrying the dry tone of someone who'd seen enough unusual cases to know that unusual usually meant complicated. "Mr. Delgado, you're arguing that your client found what amounts to a time capsule of assets hidden by a missing person and wants to distribute them to claimants based on a 40-year-old journal." "That's correct, Your Honor," Delgado said, standing. "We're asking the court to recognize that these assets were held in informal trust by Robert Bishop. that his disappearance in 1983 did not terminate the trust's intent, and that the rightful beneficiaries are the individuals or their heirs listed in Bishop's records. Judge Morales turned to Cross's lead attorney, a man named Sheridan with silver hair and a voice like butter over gravel. "And you're arguing that your client's father had a superior claim based on a loan agreement predating the alleged trust?" "That's correct, Your Honor," Sheridan said smoothly. Vincent Cross Sr. lent Bishop capital with the explicit understanding that all assets would serve as collateral. When Bishop defaulted, that collateral became property of the Cross estate. We have promissory notes, signed agreements, and documentation of Bishop's failure to repay. The fact that Mr. Wade's grandfather helped hide these assets doesn't erase the debt, it compounds it. The arguments went on for 2 hours. Delgado presented Bishop's journal, meticulously documented transactions, letters from clients or their families attesting to deposits made. He called Linda Brennan to the stand. She testified about her father's trust in Bishop, the devastation when the money disappeared, the decades of wondering if they'd been fools. She cried, not dramatically, but in the quiet way people cry when grief is old and familiar. Sheridan cross-examined her gently, almost kindly, which somehow made it worse. He established that she had no written contract, no receipts, just her father's word and a 40-year-old memory. He suggested, without quite saying it, that Bishop might have been running a Ponzi scheme and that the journal could be self-serving fiction. Then he called his own witness, a financial analyst who testified that the bonds and gold had likely been purchased with Cross Sr.'s loan money, making them technically Cross property. Delgado countered with an expert on trust law, who explained that intent matters, that informal trusts are recognized in Colorado if sufficient evidence exists. The judge asked pointed questions. How do we know Bishop wasn't embezzling? How do we verify these clients are who they say they are? What happens if more claimants surface after a ruling? Each question felt like a trapdoor opening under my feet. By the time the court recessed for lunch, I felt hollowed out. We sat in a diner across the street, nobody eating much. Linda pushed a piece of pie around her plate. Eugene stared out the window. "You did good," Delgado said to them. "You told the truth. That counts." "Does it?" Linda asked quietly. "Because it feels like we're losing." "We're not done yet," Delgado said, but his tone suggested we weren't winning either. The afternoon session started with Sheridan playing his trump card. He presented a lien document, filed in 1982, that listed Bishop's property, including all accounts, holdings, and assets tangible and intangible, as collateral for the Cross loan. It was notarized, legal, ironclad. Judge Morales studied it, and I watched her expression shift. "This changes things," she said. "Mr. Delgado, how do you respond to a recorded lien that predates your trust claim?" Delgado stood, and for the first time I saw him hesitate. "Your Honor," he said slowly, "a lien on assets doesn't negate a trust obligation. The assets may have been encumbered, but they were still held in trust for specific beneficiaries. Bishop's intent, as documented in his journal, was to return these funds. That intent, combined with my client's good faith effort to honor it, should take precedence over a predatory loan designed to strip a man of his livelihood. Predatory is editorializing," Sheridan said mildly. "My client's father operated a legitimate lending business. But let's address intent. Your Honor, Mr. Wade has had possession of these assets for months. He could have liquidated them, paid his debts, and disappeared. Instead, he's here, trying to give away over $1 million. That's admirable. But admirable doesn't override legal claims. The law is clear. First lien holder takes priority." He sat down, satisfied. The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Then Judge Morales spoke. "Mr. Wade," she said, looking at me directly, "stand up." I stood, legs uncertain. "You're 23 years old," she said. "You bought this property for $1. You found assets worth over $1 million. You could have kept quiet, sold everything and walked away. Why didn't you?" I swallowed, mouth dry. Because my grandfather ran, Your Honor. I don't know if he was a coward or if he was protecting himself, but either way he left something unfinished. Bishop made promises to people who trusted him. Those people lost everything. If I keep this money, I'm just another person who took from them, and I don't want to be that. What do you want to be? She asked. Honest, I said, even if it costs me. She studied me for a long moment, then looked at the families, then at Cross and his lawyers. Here's what I'm going to do, she said. This court recognizes the lien filed by Vincent Cross Sr. However, the court also recognizes that the assets in question were held under circumstances suggesting fiduciary duty to third parties. Therefore, I'm ordering the following. The assets will be liquidated under court supervision. The Cross estate will receive compensation equal to the original loan amount plus reasonable interest, calculated at 5% annually. That's approximately $400,000. The remaining funds, after legal fees and court costs, will be distributed proportionally to the claimants listed in Bishop's journal or their verified heirs. She banged the gavel. This court is adjourned. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Cross's face went red, then pale. Sheridan leaned over, whispered urgently. Cross stood abruptly, said something I couldn't hear, and walked out. Linda Brennan grabbed my hand, squeezed it hard enough to hurt. Thank you, she whispered. Eugene Hastings thumped his walker on the floor. I'll be damned, he said, grinning. Justice at 91. Who'd have thought? Delgado packed his files, looked at me with something like respect. You just gave away about $600,000, he said. Feel stupid yet? No, I said. I feel like I can sleep tonight. Good, he said, because the hard part's over. Now we just have the paperwork. He was wrong about the hard part being over, but he was right about the paperwork. It took another 4 months to liquidate the bonds, sell the gold, pay the fees, and distribute the funds. Each family got between $40,000 and $90,000, depending on what their relatives had deposited. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Linda paid off her mortgage. Eugene bought a new car and donated $10,000 to a food bank. A man named Peters, whose father had been one of the original clients, used his share to send his daughter to college. They all sent letters. Some thanked me. Some told me I was crazy for not keeping it. One, from a woman whose grandfather had lost his farm in the 80s, simply said, "You finished what should have been finished a long time ago. That matters more than you know." I kept the ranch. The house was still condemned, but I had enough left over after paying my father's debts to start repairs on the barn, fix the fences, maybe even drill a well. I wasn't planning to farm. I didn't know the first thing about it, but the land felt like it had a voice now, something it hadn't had when I'd arrived. Grace Morrison stopped by one afternoon in early spring, brought coffee and a surveyor's map. "Thought you might want to know where your property lines actually are," she said, "in case you're planning to stay." "I am," I said. She smiled. "Your grandfather would be proud." "I don't know," I said. "He ran." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe he did what he had to do, so someone like you could finish it right. Either way, you're not him, you're you, and that's enough." I watched her drive off, then walked out to the barn, where the concrete slab still sat, patched now but visible. I'd thought about covering it completely, but Delgado had suggested leaving it as a marker. A reminder that some things stay buried until the right person digs them up. The sun was setting, painting the plains in shades of gold and rust, and I realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about what I'd built, not wealth, not security, something harder to name but easier to carry, the kind of inheritance you earn by choosing who you want to be when no one's watching. If you made it this far, you've walked with me through dirt and decisions, through courtrooms and buried gold, through the question that sits at the heart of every inheritance. What do we owe the past, and what do we owe ourselves? This isn't just a story about treasure. It's about the choice to finish what someone else couldn't, to honor the messy, complicated, unfinished business of being human. If stories like this resonate with you, if you believe that the hardest choices are often the ones that matter most, subscribe to this channel. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that integrity costs something, but pays back in ways a bank account never will. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done? Kept the money, returned it, run? I want to know, because your answer says more about who you are than any treasure ever could. There are more stories buried in this ground, more questions waiting to be unearthed. Stick around. The next one might be yours.